But our next keynote speaker sees us as being in a race of sorts, a race to resilience, a race to net zero, a race for capital, multiple races, a race to protect our children's future. Brought to us by KPMG, please welcome KPMG International's Global Head of Infrastructure, Government and Healthcare, Richard Threlfall.
Thank you. Jack, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. What is estimated, where's the slide? There we go. What is estimated to happen 6 years, 1 month, and 14 days from today? 6 years, 1 month, 14 days from today is not long off, is it? This is the point at which, on the world's current trajectory of carbon emissions, it is expected that the average temperature on the planet will cross over 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Doesn't sound very much, does it? It's the sort of 1.5 degrees, if it was on your room thermometer, you wouldn't think it of any consequence. In March of this year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published its summary report of all the work that they've done over the last 5 years. It's the last report they will publish before COP28. And this is what they say about the point at which we go over 1.5 degrees only 6 years from now. Above 1.5 degrees, ecosystems such as warm water coral reefs, coastal wetlands, rainforests, and polar and mountain ecosystems will have reached or surpassed hard adaptation limits. And as a consequence, some ecosystem-based adaptation measures will also lose their effectiveness. Brackets, high confidence. So what does that mean? It means that at that point, the world is at risk of losing control of the ability to bring the Earth's warming back. It is the point at which there are at least 4 of the world's tipping points which move to a position where they are irreversibly, irretrievably damaged. The West Antarctic ice sheet, the Greenland ice sheet, the Australasian coral reefs, and the permafrost of northern Canada. We're really clever as humanity, aren't we? And we've got this belief, I think, that we can solve any challenge that the world throws at us. But the thing that really scares me, and honestly, I think should really scare all of you, is that as it stands today, no one has a solution that guarantees that we will be able to stop the continued erosion of the world's temperature ecosystems after we get over that 1.5 degree limit. Now, it's possible that somebody will produce some technology that scrapes carbon out of the atmosphere, but would you like to take a bet on it? And all of us in this room will be fine. But our children and our grandchildren, it's already inevitable that we are bequeathing them a worse quality of life than we have been privileged to enjoy. And there is a severe risk that if we do not act a lot faster than we are today, that what we actually bequeath to our children and our grandchildren is a nightmare. So before I go on to anything else, can I just leave this thought that this is desperately, desperately urgent. And amongst all the talk of politics and all the talk of businesses, my question to you is, what are you doing in your personal and your business and your public sector lives in order to stop this disaster. I live in a beautiful small town in West Yorkshire called Ilkley. It's right on the southern edge of the Yorkshire Dales. This was Ilkley in November 2020, when the River Wharfe that runs through the middle of the town burst its banks and flooded the centre of the town. No one lost their lives, and this is completely trivial compared to the flooding that happened here in the North Island at the beginning of this year. It's completely trivial compared to the heat waves that took so many lives in India last summer, utterly trivial compared to the wildfires that we saw in California and Australia at the end of the year before. But I think we all recognise that these are just all examples of this increase in the frequency and the ferocity of climatic events. And this chart, drawn from data from Munich Re, which unfortunately they've stopped compiling in the last couple of years, shows this fourfold increase since the beginning of the chart in 1980 in terms of the loss impact of those climate events. So what's all this got to do with infrastructure? Well, it has absolutely everything to do with infrastructure, because infrastructure is the foundation of civilization. Everything that separates us from nomadic existence is infrastructure. And I used to be on stages like this and think it was enough to talk about infrastructure as the foundation of civilization, but I think we've all come to realize in the last few years that it has to be a foundation of sustainable civilization driven by sustainable infrastructure. And infrastructure is absolutely on the front line of what I just spoke about in terms of the climate emergency, because it's responsible for nearly 80% of all the world's carbon emissions. And that's both our bad as a sector, but it's also now our responsibility and our opportunity. And infrastructure, of course, is also on the front line in terms of the impact of climatic events, as you know only too well, here in New Zealand. And indeed, 88% of all of the adaptation costs needed globally relate to infrastructure adaptation in order to protect that existing infrastructure, in order to protect that quality of life that it gives us. And although I am particularly exercised, as you can see, about climate warming, it's not just about climate warming. I really liked earlier this morning when Becky Woods referenced the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and I agree with her that we should be, everything that we do in a society today, we should be referencing it back to the achievement of the UN SDGs as the world's balanced scorecard of everything across both environmental and social impacts. And 92% of the underlying indicators of the UN Sustainable Development Goals are also related back to infrastructure. So infrastructure has this phenomenal outsized influence and the ability to be the driver of protecting that quality of life for our future generations. And that really is the subject of everything I want to talk about this afternoon. So what do we need to do? This slide attempts to pull together three themes which I think are the foundation stones of what any country needs to do, and references some things that have already been said by one or two of the speakers that I've heard here this morning. Three things that every country needs to do. First of all, we need that absolute clarity from government around what it is that the country is trying to do and the targets. And that can only come from government, because only government has the responsibility and the accountability to make decisions about the prioritization and the trade-offs necessary in order to do that. But it's also the case that government has to do that, because so many times I hear businesses say they're crying out for the clarity from government of what the target is so that they can line up behind it. And so, for example, now that within the last couple of months, the European Commission, the European Union, has passed the legislation that means no petrol or diesel vehicle allowed to be sold in the EU after 2035. Now the industry knows exactly what the deadline is, and we can expect the innovation to follow. Innovation is a subject of the second prong of this triangle. I said at the beginning, this is all desperately urgent. We need to do everything we possibly can to move much, much, much faster than we are doing today, both in terms of the decarbonisation of infrastructure with new assets and the protection and adaptation of existing infrastructure assets. And there's two ways that we can do that. One is through harnessing the technology and the digital capability that we have today. And thank heavens, in a sense, we're really lucky, because if we were facing this climate emergency 20 years ago, we would really be in trouble. But as it happens today, we're in a much better space because of that technology. But it's also around the governance that allows us to move at pace. I'll come back to these things in a bit more detail in a second. And the third thing we need to do is create a sustainable funding model. And that is ultimately all about funding, because it's all about the wealth of a society and the ability of a society to plough that wealth back. And it's also about trying to get financing on the best possible terms in order that you can borrow, but you don't waste too much money in that borrowing. So what I want to do now is just go into each of these in a little bit more detail. So, starting with the clarity needed from government, and Becky referred to this document earlier today, the Transforming Infrastructure Performance Roadmap that was published by the UK government some while ago. And I really, really like this graphic, because this to me is exactly what a country should be putting forward in terms of a holistic plan for its infrastructure development, guided against the UN Sustainable Development Goals at the top, recognizing the role of the built environment nested within the natural environment, the role of technology, references digital twins in the middle of it, recognizing all of that as a system of systems and putting the place in place between the governance to make all this stuff happen. And it's beautiful, but the trouble is, it's sort of a work of fiction. Because the document that this comes from is a brilliant expose, in my view, of what you should do, but this is not reflected in what the UK government actually does, or how the UK government actually works. And I had the privilege in December of giving evidence to the House of Lords, one of the House of Lords committees, around the way in which government in the UK, as I suspect also here, is siloed, and the way that decisions are made and the prioritisation is siloed into different departments and using different methodologies, and you don't have anyone standing back and making proper prioritisation decisions across the whole portfolio of what we're trying to do, which we could no longer afford to do, because we absolutely have to make those prioritisation decisions in order to drive net zero as fast as possible. Even if we were to get that right at a government policy level, it needs to then translate and carry through onto the ground. And so, for example, it needs to carry through regulation. And again, I would argue that we can see the theory of it, but talking specifically from a UK perspective, again, I'm not sure the practice is quite there. This particular graphic is taken from a piece of work that we're doing as KPMG at the moment with Southern Water in order to help create a business case for their interventions for coastal resilience and supply resilience, and also reduction in pollution across their networks. We have challenges with our water systems very similar to those that I know you have here in New Zealand. And the regulator, Ofwat, has set, if you look across the top, these 4 nested sets of criteria that they've asked Southern Water to evidence in order to effectively get the regulatory funding approval to charge customers to do these interventions. The need for the investment, the best option for customers, the cost efficiency, customer protection. And it all sounds great, doesn't it? But the trouble is, and this is a problem across all the regulators in the UK today, it's still sitting on the fence because the regulators are being put in the impossible position of making what is essentially a political decision, which is the balance between the need to invest now in order to protect future generations versus the affordability impact on customers today. And so you end up with this balance from need for investment on one side down to so-called customer protection on the other. And I wonder why it's just the customer, because actually this is about the whole of the community's asset, not just those that happen to pay for it within that particular area. But again, the UK is not unique in terms of not really having lent into this challenge of trying to resolve the fact that we need to be investing much, much more now in order to protect our future. Technology. We are, as I said before, at this extraordinary moment in time where we have all of these technologies that are able to help us to move much, much quicker in terms of the decarbonisation, in particular, of our assets. And we've seen spectacular progress in the last 10 years, a 90% drop in the cost of lithium-ion batteries, a 90% drop in the cost of solar, a 90% drop in the cost of offshore wind. And that volume means that we're now at levels where, across nearly all of the world's economies, renewable technologies, for example, in energy generation, are at a par or cheaper than fossil fuel-generated technologies. But what we need to do is move much, much faster in terms of embedding these technologies in terms of the way that a country invests. And I come back again to the responsibility of government, because government is a major buyer of infrastructure, in some cases, absolutely the overwhelmingly major buyer of infrastructure, or the director of the buying of infrastructure through the way it implements regulation. Government alone has the ability to shift these markets. To take an example from that's happened from the UK, the dramatic progress that was made in offshore wind in the UK, where in the space of 5 years, we went from the entire cost being borne by the public sector to the entire cost being without subsidy in the private sector, was because of a program being run and an auction process being run that drove the innovation through the private sector. This is an example from the US, city of Ithaca, which is the first US city to commit to net zero by 2030 and is being observed by a lot of other major US cities in terms of how it goes about doing it. And what the city of Ithaca has agreed to do is implement a digital twin in the same way, for example, that Singapore has been exploring for the last few years, in order that they can make decisions about the prioritization of infrastructure across everything that they could do. And in the past, we would have always prioritized infrastructure on cost-benefit analysis that was referenced earlier this morning. But I would argue today, we have to make infrastructure decisions on the basis of the pace of decarbonisation, the pace to net zero, the speed with which we build the resilience of the assets that protect our communities. And we can do that today using digital twin technology in a way we couldn't have done 5 years ago. So again, the need is to grasp as fast as possible the power of these technologies. I'll give one last example in the technology space. Many of you will be aware of the super city concept in Saudi Arabia called NEOM. NEOM is planning to build homes for 9 million people, nearly twice the population of New Zealand. More than 90% of those homes will be built on a off-site factory environment basis, where quality control and driving down the embedded carbon and so on can all be managed. That is the sort of thinking I believe every country now needs to take on. Moving at pace, I said before, isn't just about technology, it's also about governance. This slide is taken from a piece of work that we are doing at the moment for the UNECE, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. We're looking at how the PPP model needs to be adapted in order to meet the needs of post-disaster, post-conflict environments. There is a very particular reason for doing this work now, which of course is Ukraine, but it is also, equally applicable to, for example, the rebuilding of southern Turkey after the earthquakes there. And the same logic, I would argue, would be equally applicable, to help Indonesia build a new capital city. Anywhere where you have to contemplate the wholesale building or rebuilding of a country or a territory's infrastructure. And I won't go into all the detail of it, but the simple message is, let's move away from project by project, because we haven't got time. We haven't got time to spend 10 years developing bespoke projects. We have to work on a programmatic basis at the level of decision-making, prioritization, procurement, the financing. It all has to be done at a programmatic level. And then when you get down to the actual building, you need to enable an entire supply chain, again, using technologies that the construction industry has been relatively slow to adopt, but I would argue not their fault, it's mostly the buyer's fault for not having forced it. Using those technologies to build across whole portfolios of assets at the same time, not one by one. And then this brings me finally to the last leg of that three-legged stool, which is the funding and the financing model. And the hard truth is, and it's one of those conversations I don't think any society sort of wants to have or is having, but almost no country of the world is investing at the pace I believe is now necessary in order to rise to the challenge we're facing. The data's a few years old for comparability, but I doubt it's much different today. On average, we've known for the last 20 years that the average of OECD countries' investment in infrastructure is only about 3% of their GDP. So we can get very excited about borrowing money, which ultimately just indebts the future generation. But the bigger question is a society, particularly a developed society like in New Zealand or in my home country in the UK, is our society prepared to start foregoing some of what we could have today in order to protect that future for our children by investing more and much, much more and much faster now? And there is a proper role for borrowing, because what borrowing does is it allows us to match some of when the benefit is received by a community of its asset with when some of that is paid for. And the longer terms that you can get borrowing for, the better that match exists. So I think there's a really critical role for borrowing. But if we're going to borrow, we need to do so on the best possible terms, or otherwise we just add to our fiscal burden today. And in today's world, there is such a demand in the private sector to invest in green assets that any country or any region or any city that doesn't publicize and market what it is doing to private investors within a construct of sustainability and ESG are completely missing a trick. This beautiful example is taken from Thames Tideway, the super sewer in London. This relates to the £1.8 billion worth of green bonds that were sold into the market in 2017. 2017, 5 years ago, long before the boom in ESG funds that we've seen in the last couple of years. 8 times oversubscribed. And what this particular chart shows is the way that project mapped a whole series of indicators that are the KPIs that they're being held accountable for on that project. They mapped them back to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I started this speech quite emotional about the threat that I think the world is facing. And I take none of that back, because what really scares me is I think we're all sleepwalking as humanity into this disaster by not realizing just how urgent it is and what we need to sacrifice today as populations in order to safeguard that future for our children. But I'm also a great optimist. And I agree with Jane Goodall, for example, that it is imperative that we hold a hope. And I think one of the things that gives me hope is that I believe that humanity is at its most creative when it is under threat. This is a picture I took myself of a hibiscus that I have nurtured in my house for the last 15 years. And a bit like many countries' infrastructure, it's gone through periods of neglect. There are periods when this poor hibiscus doesn't get watered or overwatered, or when it gets completely baked. And generally, its response to that is that all its leaves fall off and it looks really sad. But what I've noticed over many years is that, in common with many plants, when that hibiscus is most stressed is when it produces its most beautiful flowers. I believe humanity is at this moment at its point of greatest stress, but I have this hope, this belief, this absolute belief that we can find a path to tackle both the climate and the social emergencies that our world is facing, and that we can bequeath to our children a sustainable quality of life. And that should be true, of course, as much in this beautiful country of New Zealand as anywhere else in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Is degrowth an option?
I said there was a conversation that societies are not leaning into, which is around the sort of the balance between our consumption today, particularly when everyone's feeling under affordability pressures. So it's not a good time to try and have this conversation, but it's a real one, versus the investment in the future. But you put your finger on the other conversation we're not having as a society, which is continuous growth is not possible. And that sort of feels super radical, doesn't it? Because ever since the invention of money, we've been used to the idea that we could just keep growing and keep growing and keep growing. But we've known for at least the last 30, 40 years that the world's finite resources are hitting a crunch point, and growth will have to stop. Now, we've probably got another 80 or 100 years before we reach those hard limits. But I think one of the things that's stressing out societies is that they are having to start contemplating a world in which we need to be content with what we've got and not just rely on growth to fuel that future.
How do you imagine that conversation happening?
Well, I mean, this is, I know they might not like it, but this is what politicians are for. Politicians should be there to be stewards of the future of a country, and to steer the conversations that a country needs to have. And in practical terms, I think it means, starting to think about, we need to stand back and think about what's the plan for the future of New Zealand, or take it up to the whole world, right? The world will hit 10 billion people, by the end of this century. What would it take to feed that entire population of the world sustainably? What would it take for everyone in the world to have good healthcare? What would it take? Right? What's that picture? What's that picture for New Zealand? Right? Look forward to that point in time. What would it take for all of the energy needs of New Zealand to be renewable? And what's the absolute quickest you can do it? What would it take to turn every vehicle in this country into an electric vehicle? What would it take to do it? That's the conversation, the practical end of the conversation that needs to be had.
Yeah, it's actually a case of working backwards to work forwards, in a sense.
Yes.
You talked about first of all, you talked about the infrastructure shortfall that basically every country on earth has, but the tension that politicians and leaders have to grapple with when it comes to addressing some of those short-term concerns, especially over affordability and debt, and the longer-term challenges that we face. So how should leaders go about trying to strike that balance? How should they think about that problem?
So I think there's a need for a country to sort of, as well as that sort of looking from the future backwards, there's a need for a country to be really clear about what its baseline expectation is of quality of life today.
Yeah.
Clean drinking water for everyone, everywhere. To take a not quite entirely random example, what level of education is good enough, and then make sure that you're funding that, and at the same time investing in all those things you need to do in order to protect that future.
Yeah.
Now, I guess you're trying to challenge me to say, is it possible to square that circle? But that's the conversation that politicians need to, encourage a society to have.
So by some measures, New Zealand's infrastructure shortfall is more than $200 billion. So roughly two-thirds of GDP.
I heard that this morning.
Yes, you will have heard that term a few times. Roughly two-thirds of GDP. Are there innovative funding models that you have come across in your work and travels that you think might be applicable in a New Zealand context?
So I guess we need to be super clear about the sort of the funding financing distinction in this conversation, because ultimately the wealth is either the wealth of today or the wealth of the future, and you can borrow into the wealth of the future. But that is what you're dealing with. So it's the carving up of that. I think one of the things I've seen a lot of done very successfully across a lot of the world is city-level investment rather than investment at the level of the entire country.
Right.
So, for example, the US have been doing this for absolutely decades in terms of their municipal bonds. There was reference made this morning by one of the speakers to the city deal type model and bringing that to New Zealand. I think there's a lot to be said for giving communities, whether that's at a city level or even below the level of the city, a sense of responsibility for its own destiny and its ability to invest in its own future, and to unlock the ability of that community to make decisions about, for example, how much they borrow and what they can do in order to invest back in that. Those are the sorts of things I think countries really need to look at.
If it is community-led, thinking about who tends to vote in local body elections in New Zealand, is it likely that those decisions, those funding decisions, are likely to actually benefit future generations in the city? Or are they more interested in protecting their own interests in the short term?
Well, I mean, this comes down to the absolutely fundamental question, doesn't it? Which is goes to my challenge to all of us, which is I don't it shouldn't really matter whether you're 20 years old or 80 years old. Do you care enough about the future for the country's children and the future of the country to be able to vote for the things that need to be done? And there's plenty of precedents in history for where communities have made those, you might call them altruistic decisions. And arguably nearly all infrastructure is an altruistic decision, because most of the benefit does lie in the future, not today.
Yeah.
When they, I had a slide related to the Thames super sewer, but the Thames super sewer is there in order to deal with some of the challenges from the Victorian sewage system. But the Victorian sewage system was built for 4 times the capacity required.
Yeah. Which is remarkable.
Which is remarkable. So we need to start thinking in that sort of way as a society.
Well, okay, so where do public exchanges and publicly traded companies fit in that? Because if you are a business leader, how do you balance your fiduciary duties and responsibilities with some of those longer term interests?
Yeah, so I get quite cross about this fiduciary duty argument, because, again, if we could agree, as I hope we can, that we really are facing an emergency, for businesses, for example, to say, well, it's not my problem because I'm just following my fiduciary duty and making sure my shareholders get as rich as possible, it doesn't cut it. And actually, I think my sense is, one of my points of optimism is I think across the world, the expectations on businesses have shifted quite dramatically in the last 5 years. And I think businesses that continue to think like that will not be in business in 10 years' time. It's already the case that businesses that are seen to be operating in a way that's not sustainable are struggling to attract good talent, are not getting finance at the best rates they can, and are finding it harder to sell their products. All that will be turbocharged in the next couple of years when governmental regulation forces disclosure. And as some of you may know, again, the EU has been sort of fastest out of the blocks with this, and the so-called corporate sustainability reporting directive that passed into law only a couple of months ago will require nearly every big business in Europe to have full ESG disclosure within the next couple of years. And I think that'll be a game changer because it will clear away the greenwashing, because everyone will be able to see transparently who's green and who isn't.
Okay, I'm glad you brought that up, because how do you quantify some of those measures? Relative to a relatively straightforward cost-benefit analyses,
Yeah.
Some of those measures are a little more wishy-washy.
Yeah, so I came under challenge on this in that House of Lords committee that I referenced. Firstly, I think we've got no choice, right?
Yeah.
We absolutely have to make decisions on a basis that is at least as cognizant of the sort of the ESG, the sustainability impact, as it is of the financial metrics. And I think the sort of econometric sophistication is growing to the point already today where you can properly bring in those ESG considerations alongside the financial. Sure, there's some subjectivity in it, but what doesn't wash is to do what we've done for all of the last 100 years, which is basically make the decision on financial grounds and just do the sort of the ESG on the side.
What do you think of PPPs?
So I agree with the answer that Becky gave earlier, which is they absolutely have their place. But step back from that, if it is so crushingly urgent that we invest so much as fast as possible, we absolutely have to have private finance at the table. That's a given, right? We cannot solve what the world is facing unless, and why wouldn't we want to unlock the trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars that's locked up in pension funds and sovereign wealth funds and is desperate to invest in infrastructure, absolutely desperate. And PPP is one model of doing that, and we can get it wrong in some cases and we do it right in others. My main point is the one I made earlier, which is we need to move away from one project at a time to programmatic.
Are there specific things that you think differentiate the PPPs that work and the ones that don't?
Well, again, a lot of things that Becky said this morning: openness, transparency, proper dialogue across all stakeholders. I mean, I had the privilege to be involved for 10 years of my life with a PPP to put a new bridge over the River Mersey, and I think it was a really, really good example, but that was because of the way that the council leadership, were very, very open with everybody, from central government stakeholders to their local community stakeholders, about the way they went about it, and that led to a really, really good result.
When it comes to really, really big projects, the likes of Auckland Central Rail Loop, the HS2 in the UK, the California High-Speed Rail, are we using those big projects sufficiently as a catalyst for change towards more sustainable construction practices?
We have to. I made some reference to the fact that I think a lot of the onus lies with the buyer of infrastructure, which is often government. Because across nearly all the world, construction industry is so fragmented that they are generally they're a taker. They're a price taker, and they will do what they're told to do or what the procurement drives them towards. And whenever we have a huge project like an HS2 or California High-Speed Rail or some of the examples you've given here in New Zealand, they can drive the whole market. Yeah. They don't just set an example, they can drive the whole market. So for example, on Crossrail, they set an objective of basically taking 50% of the content out of all, 50% of the cement out of all of the concrete in that project, and that then moves the market because it starts to move the supply chain.
the construction sector has been pretty slow when it comes to more sustainable practices compared to some other sectors and industries. What role should technology and the investment in technology play in trying to drive more sustainable construction practices?
Yeah, so again, as I said before, the technology is one of our saviours, if we get it right. I don't think you can expect much of the industry to invest in those technologies unless there's a strong buying signal, again, predominantly from government or from the big utilities. So we need this consistency of message, which is, right, we're going to do all these big projects as much as possible offsite. We're going to try and drive all the embedded carbon out of them. We're going to do them all on a digitally enabled platform, and so on and so on. And those must be absolute requirements that then force the entire supply chain across New Zealand to respond.
Well, thank you so much for giving us your time. I hope you enjoy your time in New Zealand, and won't you join me in thanking Richard Threlfall.
Thank you.